Okay, today's lesson is how do we solve quadratic equations. And there are two ways we're going to talk about solving these equations. The first way is going to be by graphing with a graphing calculator, and the second way is going to be by factoring. Now, you would use graphing when you have a graphing calculator. Since there are times when you do not have a graphing calculator, we need to know how to also solve them by factoring. So this is when there's no graphing calculator allowed. This will also show us the relationship between how factoring and graphing are related to each other in terms of quadratic equations. So first, let's talk about graphing. Now, when we graph a quadratic equation, which we just did in our previous lesson, say we have the problem negative x squared plus 2x equals negative 8, and we want to graph this. The first thing that we need to do before we graph it is we need to put it in what we call standard form. Okay, so we're going to put it in standard form. Okay, put in standard form. So standard form is where we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So this is not in the standard form, it's not equal to 0. So we would say negative x squared plus 2x, and then I move the 8 over here. To do that, I add 8 to this side, and so I add 8 to the other side. So plus 8 equals 0. And this is standard form. Now, the next thing you would do is in your calculator, when you go to the y equals button. So let's say for y1, we put in, and remember this is a negative, it's the negative sign, not the minus sign, or you'll get an error. Negative x squared plus 2x plus 8 equals 0. So we would put this in, sorry, you don't put equals 0. You just put this in to the graphing calculator at y1, and then we would hit the graph button. If you get an error at this point, go ahead and reset your calculator so that you can get rid of any miscellaneous. You might have your plot on. Make sure your plots are off. And then once you do that, you would get a graph that looks something like this. And this is what I have here. And then it goes up to about 9. Okay, so it goes up right here in the middle. Okay. And then it's downward. Now we know from the previous section that this is our vertex up here at the top. It's negative because we had a negative x squared plus 2x plus 8. So because of the negative, it goes in a downward direction. It has a max value here. And there's a couple things that you can do to find these points. One thing is to use the trace function, and it will allow you to move along this. But if you look and see here, what's happening is when we graph this function, we're saying this function when it equals 0. Now, this 0 stands for our y value. So y moves up here, and x is, so when y is 0, we're on the x-axis. So we want to look at our graph and say, well, what 2 points are there when y is equal to 0? These points here are called the roots, or they might also be called the zeros. So you could see questions that have those two different types of, it'll say, what are the roots of this function, or what are the zeros? And they are the points where the parabola crosses the x-axis, or this is where y equals 0. That's where it gets the zeros name. And then roots, as you could think of it as this is the part above, and then this is the part kind of the ground level at the bottom. So when we look here, we see that at 4, okay, we have a value. Now this is over at 4, 0. And then over here, we're at -2, 0. Okay? So usually you'll see either the points listed this way, 4, 0, and -2, 0. Or you might have just them listed where you have 4, -2. But do not put parentheses because these are not points. These are just a listing. This is where x equals 4 and x equals 2 for these two. Okay. So depending on the type of question, a lot of multiple choice, I believe the last benchmark talked about it this way, and it had just 2 answers. These would be the solutions to where y equals 0. Now, let me show you how to do this with factoring, because this only works if you have a graphing calculator. So if you don't have a graphing calculator and you need to factor it, let's go ahead and look at the equation again. Let's put it in standard form. Negative x squared plus 2x equals -8. So our first step is to put it in standard form. So negative x squared plus 2x plus 8 equals 0. Now if you remember, we would take out any common factors first. There's no common factors between these three, but there is a negative here. So this negative we want to make it a positive in order to make our solution easier. So I'm actually going to take out a -1, x squared plus 2x, oh, I've got to change my signs, minus 8 equals 0. So this changes the signs, and then I can simply divide by -1, which doesn't change anything, but it gets rid of that negative. So I have x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. So finally, we've got a cleaned up equation, and we want to factor this. So we say to ourselves, well, I have an 8 here. What are multiples of 8? Okay, so factors of 8 that can add to 2. First I say, well, 8 and 1. Well, 8 and 1 can't possibly either add or subtract to 2. What about 4 and 2? Would that work? Yes, I believe that would work. So now I know I have x, and then I would say 4 and 2. Now I work on my signs. 4 times 2. One of these is going to have to be negative to give me a -8. But then the 2 have to add to be a -2. So I would say it looks like it's going to be -4 and a +2. Because -4 times a 2, that's going to give me a -8. And then -4 plus 2 gives me a -2. So I've got the -2 and the 8 here. And we can double check this to make sure it's going to work. We can say, well, -4 plus 2 is equal to -2, and then -4 times 2 equals 8. Now I am not done. This equation is factored or unfoiled, and it equals 0. Now I have to set each of these factors equal to 0. This is using my zero product property, because this is a component. This component here times this component equals 0. Okay, these two factors. Anything times 0, the only way to get 0 is to multiply it by 0. So x minus 4 equals 0, x plus 2 equals 0. And then I get x equals 4 and x equals -2. Do you see how we got the same answers as before? We got -4, a +4, sorry, and a -2 for our answers for this particular problem. Now, let's try one on your own. You can pause now if you like and work this problem. It says, solve x squared minus 6 equals -5x. And I want you to do it 2 ways. Okay, first do it by factoring. And then try graphing. And make sure, the idea is to use graphing to check. So pause now and try it and see what you get.